Okay, good afternoon. My name is Pedro Alonso. I'm the head of the PhD program in Architecture and Urban Studies at the Catholic University, academic program that hosts La Ciudad de las Palabras. Today, I have the great honor to welcome, again, a friend of our program, Mr. Iain Sinclair. First, I would like to thank the donors and sponsors that make possible this event, namely Minera Anglo-American, La Tercera Online, Tironi y Asociados, GIMSA, 3DK Computing, Electroproductos, Email Aceros, and Librerías UC. I would like also to warmly thank the support of Álvaro Rodríguez from Elige Cultura and Silvia Angelini from Economías Creativas at the Ministerio de la Cultura, las Artes y el Patrimonio. Al Cine Clubcito Diego Mondaca en Bolivia, a la revista Otra Parte sobre literatura y arte, in particular to Gabriela Esperanza in Argentina, a la revista Latin American Literature Today in Oklahoma, and special thanks to Marcelo Rioseco, to Romina de la Sota from the Panorama Cultural at Radio Beethoven, Paulina Vidal and Javiera Cornejo from the Sistema Nacional de Bibliotecas Públicas, and to greet Anglo-American pioneer schools that work with us. And to everyone that has supported us through the social media promoting La Ciudad de las Palabras during the last 15 years. Last but not least, thanks to Loreto Villarroel, true engine and power behind this wonderful project. And so without any further delay, please welcome Mr. Iain Sinclair.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me now? Yes? Good. I've been invited to talk in this very strange way that is two people. You can hear me, or it's all happening, I hope. I see Pedro's name, but I assume that I can be heard.
Yes, yep. you could go ahead. Oh, it's fine.
Yes. I go ahead. Okay.
Yes.
It's a very strange experience, really, to be linking these two cities in such a peculiar way through a little postage stamp picture of myself and as if I'm talking in a room alone to Pedro, who I can see sitting in front of me. But I want to talk about, I've been asked to talk about London and London writers. And what I would like to say first is that London is not so much a city as a great fiction. London is itself a kind of book. It's peculiar, I think, in terms of cities, in that it's not so much about the individual writers, but that the city itself is constantly revising and rewriting so that it becomes like a gigantic stone library. I went out this afternoon. I was thinking about how I could talk about the aspects of London at the moment that would relate to certain writers. And I live in an area called Hackney that has been hugely reinvented. In the 19th century, it was a industrialized suburb of the city itself being the square mile of the bankers down by the river enclosed by the Roman wall. Hackney was a suburb. It was where Samuel Pepys, the great London diarist, as a young boy, was sent to be sent somewhere healthy when he was sick. He was sent out to Hackney, which was a village beside a river on a hill. It then became a synonym for poverty and immigration in the 19th century, a lot of small factories. And at the moment, it's become the new London of the digital era. Everybody on their phones, a lot of young people, a lot of coffee, a lot of bicycles. And I walked out, and what is wonderful and magical about London is that it's probably one of the best cities for the shifts of light. You change the light so often in the course of a day. You set out under dark clouds, you're watching the planes that are beginning to move through the skies again, and suddenly the light is pink, the leaves are turning red, and you find yourself in an area called London Fields. London Fields is interesting. It's a park, but it's now like an open air gymnasium. It's full of young people on exercise machines. They have their personal trainers. They're playing basketball. It's a place that's no longer a contemplative area. It's no longer a garden. And it became a novel by Martin Amis in the 90s, which was a sort of a novel in the 80s that represented the Thatcherite London. It was a famous novel called London Fields, but it had nothing to do with this particular garden. It was more set in West London. It was just that he liked that name. And this was very typical of a kind of literature that was congratulating itself on its language and its way of reading a city, but it wasn't actually to do with specific localities and details. It wasn't to do with buildings, wasn't to do with what was happening, wasn't to do with how the city was remaking itself. And I thought of that as I walked through London Fields. But the magic of London is that you find things that you didn't know, even on your own doorstep, without even thinking about it, just thinking what I was going to say to Santiago. I found myself in a small park at the back of a church called St. Thomas's on the far side of Mare Street. And this park was like a secret. It was like an urban secret. I saw that it was stacked with graves, as if the graves were like postcards written by the dead, pushed against a wall, covered in ivy and hidden away, and a strange building in the middle of this little park. And I went into that building and I saw there was a graffiti on the wall that was quoting from the Bible. It was quoting from chapter 10 of Luke, which says, and I saw the graffiti on the wall, "But into whatsoever city ye enter, and they receive you not, go your ways out into the streets of the same, and say, even the very dust of your city, which cleaveth on us, we do wipe off against you. I say unto you, it shall be more tolerable in that day for Sodom than for this city." In other words, if the city doesn't give welcome to its migrants, then the city is damned. This is what it seemed to be implying in this small summer house in a lost garden in Hackney. And when you think about London writers, I think we have to understand there are no Londoners. Everybody is coming from somewhere else. It was a great port city. Obviously, the key person at the end of the 19th century was Joseph Conrad, who was Polish, who had first written in French, who became a merchant mariner and only came to London because London was an open city. At that time, you didn't need passports. You didn't need the papers that you needed to become a seaman in France. You could just come to London. It was the city where the poet Rimbaud and Verlaine, his companion, had lived. It was where Vincent van Gogh was living when he was trying to become an art dealer. It was a city that was open to all the world, and those are the kind of books of London that I think we have to think about. But where is London and what is London? The actual title of our talk was supposed to be The City and Its Writers. I'll come back to that. The city, the correct city of London, is a square mile. It's just an area of the riverfront enclosed by an old Roman wall. It's a city of banks. It's a city of paranoia. There's a huge level of surveillance. Every inch is covered by CCTV. Everybody who moves is in a kind of film. There's even now eavesdropping equipment that you can hear everything that's said. And yet nobody really lives in the city. The city is an empty quarter. It's just money, and it's just laundering of money. It means that that London is no longer specifically a part of England. It's a world city, and therefore it has a world literature. But as nobody lives there, who are the writers? If you want to find who are the writers of the literal city of London, they are the poets. They are the poets in the past. John Keats, the great romantic poet who died so young in his mid-20s, he was born at Moorgate, right on one of the gates of the city. Geoffrey Chaucer, the original English poet, the one who wrote about the Canterbury Pilgrims, he was a keeper of customs at Aldgate, the gate of the city to the east. John Milton was born on Bread Street in the city. Shakespeare lived in the city. It's a city of poets and playwrights. John Donne, the great poet who was also a preacher and whose effigy is in St. Paul's Cathedral, wrapped in his winding sheet. Those are the writers that you associate with the city. When it comes to the novelists, they're part of a grander London, a bigger London. What is that London? It's a huge urban sprawl. It goes beyond the original city. The official city was enclosed by the wall with its gates. On the other side of it was a sort of no man's land. It was the place where the theatres, the Elizabethan theatres grew up, where the first Shakespeare plays were put on. It was a place of public houses, of brothels, and later of dissent. If you didn't belong to the official religions, you were pushed outside the city. So the great London poet, William Blake, who is the ultimate London writer, really, is buried in a little cemetery called Bunhill Fields. And the reason for that cemetery is it's outside the walls of the city. It's just beyond. It's near Old Street. And in this small patch of ground are buried the three London writers who mean most to me in terms of travel, which would be John Bunyan, who wrote Pilgrim's Progress. He is there. Daniel Defoe, who wrote Robinson Crusoe, but also wrote A Journey Around the Whole Part of Britain, and William Blake himself, who was buried originally with a pauper's grave. He was in there with 12 other people. Later, a memorial was put up to him and his wife, Catherine. So you have a band of dissent after you come out of the official city. And then you push out towards the suburbs, the railway suburbs. And I think what London was defined by probably is the M25 motorway, which is an orbital motorway that surrounds the entire area. It's about 15 miles out. So it's about as far as you can walk in a day. And I thought just before, in the late 1990s, I wrote a book myself called London Orbital, which was about walking around the circuit of this motorway, this huge motorway, in a series of consecutive 12 walks, which carried me around the whole London. And by doing that, I saw the future of London. I saw the new architectures. I saw the science parks. I saw the pharmaceutical companies. I saw the London that belonged to the secret state, things that weren't on the map. And this is the London of another writer, J.G. Ballard. J.G. Ballard was a person who did not want to live in the center of London, but was writing about the psychology of London, the psychosis. And he wrote a book about the edgelands called Crash, which was about the effect of somebody, the psychosexual dramas of someone who uses his car. His car is his home. He lives in it. And in Kingdom Come, one of the last novels that Ballard wrote, it is about the boredom of the suburbs. And what he says is, the suburbs dream of violence, asleep in their drowsy villas, shattered by benevolent shopping malls. They wait patiently for the nightmares that will wake them into a more passionate world. And in this novel, there's a sort of strange religious revival that people form terrorist cells to attack the huge shopping malls that have grown up on the edges of cities. And when I came to make a film about London Orbital, my book about this circular road with the filmmaker Chris Pettit, J.G. Ballard had a part in that film, and he said, Iain, I want you to blow up Blue Water. Blue Water is a huge shopping mall in a chalk quarry in Kent. And Ballard's vision was that the writer should go in and destroy these shopping malls. And that became a kind of a passage in the film that was rather haunting, because it was cut with footage that had been taken in Kabul by a friend of mine who was there in the 1960s, and just held a camera out of a window. And we saw it as a sort of medieval city. And when you put that together with Ballard's vision, you have a strange idea of the suburbs of London. It's much more surreal than is generally understood. The other version of the suburbs from an earlier period is a writer called Patrick Hamilton, whose famous book, Hangover Square, came in the late 30s, and it sort of anticipated the rise of fascism by a character who was a serious drunk and was being manipulated by a woman who had fascist sympathies. But in his novel, The Slaves of Solitude, he gets at this state of suburbia from which we'll have to move in to get to London and its writers. He says, London, the crouching monster, like every other monster, has to breathe, and breathe it does in its own obscure, malignant way. Its vital oxygen is composed of suburban working men and women of all kinds, who every morning are sucked up through an infinitely complicated respiratory apparatus of trains and termini into the mighty congested lungs, held there for a number of hours, and then in the evening exhaled violently through the same channels. So it was a constant effort of London writers to define where London began and ended. And Joseph Conrad's great friend, with whom he wrote some books, called Ford Madox Ford, wrote a book called The Soul of London. And what he proposed, this is back in about 1906, what he proposed, even years before the First World War, was that you could stick a compass into the city of London, the banking city, into Threadneedle Street, set it for 50 miles and make a great sweep, a circuit around London of 50 miles. And he said, all that is London, and all that is separate from the rest of the country. There is a kind of London that would take in Oxford and Cambridge, would reach the south coast, and would include all the benefits of that, and would have a series of circular motorways with green belts in between. It was almost like Abercrombie's plan for London, which came after the Second World War, and was a sort of vision of a city that was never realized by the architects and planners. It couldn't be. And that was the disaster of this M25 motorway, was that it was too late. You know, it was 1986. It was something that should have happened in 1946. So in 1986, you get a road that encloses the London, and it's like a kind of donut of pollution. Because if you looked at it from a drone up above, you would just see this huge circle of pollution caused by the cars gridlocked around this circular road. And it's an endless road. It's a vision of endlessness. And Mrs. Thatcher, who cut the ribbon on the road in 1986, in the same year, banished the London councils, of local councils, the Greater London councils, a great building on the other bank from the Houses of Parliament. She abolished that, and she created at the same time the Big Bang, which opened up the financial markets to the world. In other words, London was just going to be about laundering money, dealing with the financial industries. Regulations were gone, and locality no longer was important. And the kind of writing that was to do with locality was no longer important. And at the same time, she was finding property on a golf course for General Pinochet. There were strong, strange connections there for her. I wanted to think what this road actually represented in terms of literature, because once you've created a circular road, it's an image of endlessness. It's a metaphor for absurdity in a way. There's no beginning and there's no end. You just go round and round and round. And the only two crossing points where you could possibly imagine that you could come off this circuit was when you had to go over the River Thames. One was in the west, where Ballard lives, in Shepperton. There's a bridge there which crosses the river, carrying the motorway. And this was an exit, I thought, the only way out was into 19th century science fiction. If you came out at Shepperton, you were straight into H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds. Wells wrote War of the Worlds in 1898. And what it was about was an invasion, a Martian invasion into the suburbs, in which the tripods of these Martian invaders cross the river and march into London, destroying it. It was like a kind of mirror image of the technology that was cause for invasion. It was like what was happening much later when in oil wars, we took our Western technology in to destroy other places. In Wells's novel, it's happening the other way around. It's London that gets destroyed. And so there's a kind of warning, a prophetic warning in this book of what might happen. And it seems to emerge from the vortex of the motorway on the west side. On the east side, the QE2 bridge spans over at Purfleet. And this is where Bram Stoker in 1897 sets his novel Dracula. And he has his abbey in Purfleet where he brings a whole lot of coffins from Transylvania with earth in, to which he can, the undead can disappear into these coffins. But what's remarkable about that novel is that it's about estate agents. Count Dracula, before he comes to London, sends for a lot of brochures of property, and he nominates certain properties that are going to be valuable to own in London and places his coffins there. So it's about kind of distribution and property, and it also reimagines the London of the 1990s, the boom years when the docklands were being developed, the new tower blocks were going up. It seemed to be anticipated a century earlier by Bram Stoker. And it also became the point where the oil refineries grew up on the river and it represented a different kind of London. If you wanted to truly understand London, I think you have to understand the river. We'll come to the river as a kind of conclusion, I think, but that understand that London grows up because of the river leading out, because of the river bringing all its valuable cargoes in, including people. Otherwise, London works as a series of small villages that have been collided together inside the belt of this huge motorway. And those villages were collided and pushed together like tectonic plates, and they all had their own writers. Hackney had a number of wonderful Jewish writers. Harold Pinter would be the most famous one, but at the same school that he went to was a writer called Alexander Barron, who wrote a novel called The Lowlife in the 1960s, which described the arrival of West Indian immigration, which he was in favor of and which he thought brought energy to the city, but some of his neighbors were already worrying about that and moving out, retreating, giving up the center of London and moving out to the suburbs. The city of London itself, the original city, as I've described, the Roman city, the city of banks, was very close to the ghetto of Whitechapel, which was the immigrant quarter, first occupied by the Huguenots, who were religious wars had driven them out of France. They settled there, became silk weavers, established the architecture with weavers' garrets and so on. And then later, from the Russian pogroms, the Jewish population arrived. Then much later, from Bangladesh, the Asians arrived, always in the same place, so close to the city. So you have the city in one hand with no real writers associated directly with it. except for the poets of earlier eras, and then the ghetto of Whitechapel, which has a whole series of Jewish literature, writers like Israel Zangwill, and later Emanuel Litvinov, Alexander Barron, that they're right alongside each other and they're competing. The other ghetto is the ghetto of entertainment and food, bars, clubs, etc. Soho. Soho has a very interesting literature that goes back probably to Robert Louis Stevenson. Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is a story about schizophrenia. It's about a double consciousness, which is the nature of London from the very beginning. The Roman legionaries worshipped the god Mithras, the Persian god, who was a god of light and dark. And the temple of Mithras has still been uncovered in the city. So you have this idea in a single building in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which is a perfect image for London, of a doctor, a respectable doctor, who goes in at the front of a house in Soho and receives his visitors and patients in the front of this house. But you go out of the back door where the same man is converted into a kind of monster who rampages through the city, a kind of precursor of Jack the Ripper or whatever. So there's a whole literature that starts from the idea of a building being split and a consciousness being split by taking a kind of a base of chemicals that allows this same person to have two identities and live these two lives, which is also represented in a particular architecture that's split. And it's the same period as Conan Doyle is introducing Sherlock Holmes, who, with the Study in Scarlet, who is a person who moves around London repeatedly, endlessly, and also has a kind of double existence, because he has his sidekick, Dr. Watson, who actually tells the story for him, so that Holmes can be this remote, super intelligent forensic intelligence, and Watson can be more of an ordinary Englishman who reports on it and gives you a kind of literature that's represented London for that period. After that, or rather before that, everything is Charles Dickens. He is probably the ultimate London writer, although he's not himself a Londoner. He comes from Portsmouth, but he arrives in London young, with a father who is feckless and never has money, so that the young boy Dickens has to work in a blacking factory, which gives a sense of the underbelly of London, which never leaves him. And I think his novels, the latter novels, like Our Mutual Friend, are the kind of ultimate London novels of the city in its pomp. London is a wealthy city. London is a city of colonies. London is sort of sends its tentacles out into the world, and Dickens taps that. And in Our Mutual Friend is the perfect Thames novel. It's a novel of the river. It starts with corpse fishing. Family are out on the river with a father and her daughter in a rowing boat, actually fishing the corpses out of the river and making money from what's found in the pockets. And then the question is, are they involved in actually killing some of these people? So you start at the lowest level, and then you bring in these other characters, and you mix the idea of water with the idea of dust, because the money in the city is emerging from the dust heaps. If you have a city that's digging itself up, building the railways, building tunnels, tearing down streets to build new all the time, then you create a lot of rubbish. You create a lot of dust and muck, and the dustman himself becomes fabulously wealthy. So there's a fortune in dust, and there's a potential fortune in water, and the dead come back in different identities, shift and switch. The characters all follow each other on enormous peregrinations backwards and forwards along the river. From the dirt to the docks, the places of the corpse fishing, to the Thames Valley, to small villages. They chase each other. There are suicides. It's an extraordinary book, an extraordinary vision of the textures of London with multiple characters. Behind that, I think, in following it up, from 1907 is Joseph Conrad's Secret Agent. Because the Secret Agent represents one of the ghettos. It's a Soho novel. There's a character there with a shop in Soho, outwardly respectable, but obviously selling pornography. And the whole thing is a front for an anarchist group who are all spying on each other, leading up to a innocent boy being sent with a bomb to Greenwich, which goes off and kills him and sparks off the crisis in which the woman kills her husband and takes off. But at the end of that book, there is a wonderful, wonderful London piece of prose by Conrad, who, after all, is an adopted Londoner. He's an invented Londoner, but he gets the idea of what London is so brilliantly, as a walking city, as a place where you stalk. And one of the characters, one of the anarchists, has this passage at the end of the book where everything has gone wrong, and he's got to get back to his house in the suburbs, and he describes this whole thing as a single walk. He could walk. He walked. He crossed the bridge. Later on, the towers of the Abbey saw in their massive immobility the yellow bush of his hair passing under the lamps. The lights of Victoria saw him too, and Sloane Square, and the railings of the park. And Comrade Ossipon once more found himself on a bridge. The river, a sinister marvel of still shadows and flowing gleams, mingling below in a black silence, arrested his attention. He stood looking over the parapet for a long time. The clock tower boomed, a brazen blast above his drooping head. He looked up at the dial, 12:30 of a wild night in the Channel. And again, Comrade Ossipon walked. His robust form was seen that night in distant parts of the enormous town, slumbering monstrously on a carpet of mud under a veil of raw mist. It was seen crossing streets without life and sound, or diminishing in the interminable straight perspectives of shadowy houses bordering empty roadways lined by strings of gas lamps. He walked through squares, places, ovals, commons, through monotonous streets with unknown names, where the dust of humanity settles inert and hopeless, one of the stream of life. He walked, and suddenly turning into a strip of a front garden with a mangy grass plot, he let himself into a small grimy house with a latchkey that he took out of his pocket. So London is a walking city. London is a city whereby villages give way to ghettos, ghettos give way to privatized zones like the new Docklands, which seems not to be part of London, but to be part of Shanghai or anywhere. There's a kind of generic quality to it, as if the buildings were just made not by architects, but by computer programs and could be revised overnight. So that London changes almost day to day, hour to hour in the digital world. It's a sort of computer-generated city with perfect pictures of itself on hoardings made up by machines that don't represent any kind of reality on the ground. There's nothing now like the adventure of London as seen by Jack London, famous American novelist who came and wrote People of the Abyss. And what he did was to treat London as a sort of documentary novel. He plunges into the lower depths of London. He exposes himself to the workhouses, to the hospitals, to the vagrants who are sleeping in the churches. And he gathers up all the statistics. But he not only does that, but he takes a whole lot of photographs, which is unusual. He's one of the first to do that, to combine this sort of novelish attempt to echo Dickens or Conrad and at the same time to do documentary photographs that give you a sense of this new London as being something that needs to be covered statistically, as it was by Charles Booth, who was a wealthy shipping magnate from Liverpool, who decided that he needed to make a map of London's poverty. So again, at the end of the 19th century, he has a lot of people at night walking, sometimes in company with police, to make street by street by street a map of where London's poverty was and the nature of that poverty, where it tipped into criminality. So you have an enormous mapping of the city. At the same time as Dickens is creating his novels, and at the same time as Mayhew is a sort of journalist, reporter who goes out into London and writes his characters. He talks to sewage workers, knife grinders, gypsies, prostitutes. He talks and interviews at length all of the personalities of a city. So the city is a series of stories that can never be told, a series of, I could, go on forever about the actual books and titles and recommending them. I haven't talked about some of the great women writers. Obviously, Virginia Woolf, famously sort of Bloomsbury bourgeoisie, echoing Joyce, but then London could never have its Joyce. James Joyce wrote A City in Dublin because you could walk that city in a single day. And in that single day, the same characters would overlap and meet each other repeatedly. So it became a kind of engine of modernism. But it didn't happen in London because London was too vast and too unknowable. The nearest recent attempt to write a kind of Joycean London would be Michael Moorcock, who was an associate of J.G. Ballard on a magazine called New Worlds. And he wrote a fantastic book called Mother London, which was essentially about the dreaming and the damage done by the Blitz in the Second World War, that there are characters who are stalking the city, all different parts of the city, somehow damaged by that experience of war. It's a magnificent novel, but it can't, in the same way as Joyce, cover all the voices, all the techniques. Maureen Duffy, who's a very fine writer, wrote a book called Londoners, wrote a book called Capital. What she did was to say that she discovered that London is not, as a novelist working in London, your job is not to produce characters and put them against a background, topographical background. Your job is to realize that the personality itself is London. London is the novel. London is a unity. London is a great beast, as Dickens often recognized, and it devours itself. And so the job of a writer is to recognize that, to recognize the darkness, to acclaim the light, and to make at least some small part of the city known, and to keep the story up to date. But it is just as W.B. Yeats, the poet who lived in London too for an important period of his life, said, the living can assist the imagination of the dead. What I think he meant was the job of a writer in London is to listen to the echoes of the writers who came before you into the same place and to continue their work, that their work is never finished, and that your job as a contemporary writer is to pick up on these echoes and to make and revive the book of the city, to keep the city alive, to see the city, perhaps as Borges did, as a labyrinth, which is one way of looking at it. The two strains in London are the labyrinth from which you can never get out. Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater writes about that labyrinth again around Soho, this idea that there is a sort of trap, there's a sort of rat run from which the writer doesn't escape, but which is his job to move through. And against that, there is this sense of the walkers. Edgar Allan Poe's famous story, The Man of the Crowd, is a classic of London psychogeography. It's this idea that there's a man who simply sits in the window of a hotel watching the crowds flow, crowds and power, seeing so many different characters, priding himself on being able to recognize all these characters like a novelist, like Dickens, but without moving. And then he makes the fatal mistake of following one of these characters. He's drawn into a stalking relationship with a character who carries him out to the suburbs. He might be a great criminal. He might be anything. He might be a preacher, a visionary, a shaman. He leads him back and he follows him for day and night, till he arrives back where he started and realizes there is no solution to it. He will never know this man. But the solution to it was that he's drawn through London. So you can be tempted into making these walks. You can be tempted into staying within the labyrinth and trying to find a way out, which is what happened to De Quincey, what happened to Arthur Machen, who tried to find his way out through Stoke Newington and the suburbs, and other writers who've been happy to stay on their patch and tell us everything they can know about it. And ultimately there is, as I said, the river. The river is London. The sediment of the river gives us London. The great stories of Conrad's Heart of Darkness, where you're waiting to set up a story that's a colonialist story in the Congo, but the boat, which is in Gravesend, also sees on the other side the darkness of London. Is the Heart of Darkness in London or is it in Africa? And for Conrad, it's both. The city is a smoky horizon full of darkness and fear and terror. And when he has his breakdown in the Congo, when he's seen the horrors of the Congo, the Belgian Congo, and the torture and the madness of what was going on there, he collapses and he comes back to London and he goes to a hospital very close to where I live in Hackney, a German hospital, bringing these images and diaries from the Congo, and cooks up the Heart of Darkness story beginning there. So it comes out of London. And at the same time as he's writing that, a couple of women living in the same street in Graham Road in Hackney die because they lose their jobs as seamstresses, and there is no employment, and they're embarrassed to beg on the streets, and they just wither away and die in the room. So the darkness is in London, the darkness is in the world, and the river carries you between the two. It's there in Conrad, it's there in Dickens, where in Great Expectations, the criminal Magwitch is trying to escape down the Thames to get out of London, because once you've been sent as a criminal to Australia, you are not allowed to return. If you return, you'll be executed. And Magwitch, who's been the benefactor to the boy in Great Expectations, is escaping down the river, but he can't escape. He's captured, he's brought back. In the second Sherlock Holmes novel, Sign of the Four, they're trying to get a boat down the river, and the criminals again are captured. There's a sort of sense of escape, but there's also a sense of people coming in. And for myself, everything begins and ends in Tilbury on the river, where my own great-grandfather, whose name was Arthur, set off on a voyage which eventually carried him to Peru and to the sources of the Amazon, where he on the Parene River, he lived with the Hashenika people for a time and wrote a book published in 1885, which sort of haunted me and was a factor in my own London writing. So when I wrote a novel called Downriver, it started in Tilbury, and the two periods and the two places fused. So I think that's basically it. I mean, I could deliver an enormous list of London books, but I think the most important thing is to get a sense of the geography, how geography is the beginning of everything, and how this vast seething entity energizes us all, challenges us all, and develops its own magnificent literature. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Iain, for your presentation. We like to ask participants to be free to put questions within the chat, so I could also give that until that questions to you. In the meantime, that somebody would also ask, if I may, Iain, to ask a question. I was quite taken by your comment on the mapping the city through writing that you were talking about, and I wonder how you see a possible relationship between writing has sort of heritage practice in quite concrete terms, because it seems that many times the things that are being written are no longer there, things that are too ordinary as to be kept, so they are demolished or destroyed. The more ordinary things, even people, when you talk about these ordinary people that is portrayed through writing, people that is no longer there, buildings that might be no longer there, and how you could, in a way, keep the city from being demolished through writing. I'm not sure if my question makes sense, but
Yeah.
that's something that I really I thought it was really interesting about this idea of mapping a city through writing.
I wish you could preserve the city through writing. I mean, you do preserve the city through writing, but perhaps only in memory. I edited a book for Hamish Hamilton and Penguin, which was called London, City of Disappearances. And it was fascinating to see what came back, you know, in a sense that some people wrote about buildings they'd loved, which had been wiped out. Some people wrote about people, paintings, whatever. What was evident was that there was an overwhelming sense of a city whereby things are disappearing very, very quickly. But then the history of London is that this has always happened. You know, obviously, you go back to the fire of London, the original city is pretty much wiped out. And the idea is then, can we plan a new city? And people like Christopher Wren came up with wonderful, rational plans for a sort of city that was never built because London resisted it. London is a kind of brain damaged city. It's a city in which there are bits and pieces survive accidentally, just enough to let you know what would be there. Other bits are brutally removed, and there are huge campaigns very often around things that mean a lot, and then they're gone. And as a writer, I think all you can do, I mean, all you're really obliged to do is to give a value to those things so that when they are physically not there, they remain there in people's memories by reading the words. The mapping is another question, because you could create a kind of map of what should be there rather than what is, which is what writing does to some degree. And I was very interested recently, there's a book by a writer called Merlin Sheldrake, who's talking about fungus and the hyphae, the tendrils that come out from funguses in the ground like mushrooms. And he was saying that they made a map of London with the railway stations and principal buildings and inserted certain fungus into it. And within a very short period, the growths that came out actually mapped the easiest and best ways to move between these things. They almost exactly duplicated the road system. Uncanny. So there is a kind of inbuilt mapping within us, which people have called ley lines, desire lines, whatever you want. If you just set out from your door in London, it's a place where you find that you walk in certain patterns. Certain patterns reveal themselves, relations of buildings to each other that are older than the buildings themselves. So even if you do obliterate buildings or whatever, something internal gives you a sense of the relations. And I think one of the gifts that architects can have is not to see whatever they're building in a very narrow sense of it's going here, but to take in the entire panorama and, you know, have an overreaching sense of of the organic nature of what needs to be done and how one piece floats into another. It's in there, you know, you have it. And we can't hang on to one single item or one single person, whatever. It's this endlessly renewing structure. If you think of ourselves as a kind of fungus, I think, or a mushroom, we can get closer to the reality.
Thank you, Iain, for that answer. We have a number of questions. This one is from Veronica Griffin. She says that if you could say anything about ghosts, what would be the participation of ghosts within this literary geography of London?
Ghosts, yeah, huge aspect of London. London is a city of ghosts primarily, and a lot of them are still alive and still around. And they as I was saying, you know, the Yeats, the living can assist the imagination of the dead. Sometimes the dead make their voices heard very loudly, and the ghosts of London accumulate, I think, in particular locations. The house where I live is a house that was built in about 1850, I think, and the people who lived in it, because we've looked at censuses, the same people who lived there stayed in the house a long time. It wasn't one of those houses where the population was changing all the time. And just sort of recently, my wife felt very strongly the presence of these previous people in the house were kind of pushing in on us, you know, because we reached a point where we thought, well, these houses, we may have to sell this house. You know, a lot of our neighbors were moving there because they couldn't afford to be in Hackney anymore. And there was a sort of a wonder. And at that moment, they weren't visible ghosts, but the sense of presence in the house was intense. And then we said, okay, oh, no, we're staying. And it kind of, you could almost sort of feel the house sigh. So I think the houses are impregnated with a ghostliness. And the dialogues of these enormous cemetery gardens that exist in London. I spoke about the M25 as a circuit, but there's also a circuit of cemeteries that go around inside that, called the Magnificent Seven, you know, from South London right the way around to Highgate, Abney Park and so on. And these places are sort of filled with people communicating in some way with the names on gravestones that are almost erased, or teasing out the lives of dead poets. There's a writer called Chris McCabe has just published a book called Buried Garden, in which he tries to find the lives of obscure writers or poets who are in this burial ground, and to bring them back to life, essentially. And I think that's a big aspect of London, is this endless toing and froing between the living and the dead, until you feel almost like a ghost yourself. And I think, you know, we can become so saturated in the nature of the city that we no longer really are able to leave it, and are almost doomed to be walking ghosts or revenants. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a very interesting question.
Thank you. There's another question by Andres Ditela. He says, thank you for this wonderful journey. Are you still writing about London, or do you feel the city has been exhausted for you? Or perhaps it has changed beyond your interest?
Yeah, a couple of years back, I wrote a book called The Last London, in the sense that after this huge period of the Olympic development, in which case all of my landscape was obliterated in big ways, and the whole of East London was being changed desperately. I thought that's as far as I can go with the kind of writing that I've done about London. I had a very simple kind of trajectory of starting as a gardener, working on the ground and looking at churches, writing poetry, and then becoming a novelist, and then writing more documentary, topographical, speculative books about London. I couldn't write about that London anymore. It was gone. It doesn't mean to say that London itself has gone, obviously not, but what we've seen recently, you know, the behavior around COVID, the kind of the Boris Johnson government, the kind of the London that I believe in or have been writing about isn't there any longer. And I think a totally different way of writing about London would have to come in, more like sort of tweets, internet, you know, a kind of faster present tense, and also the more deeply the voices of some of the immigrant people who've come and settled in London. So I think there's a London that it's kind of beyond my permissions. So the last book I've done was set in Peru largely. It was called The Gold Machine, which I followed my great-grandfather's book and journey, which was extremely interesting and conflicted for going into the background of that with my daughter. And I feel that's mainly, you know, I'm likely to be in other places in London. I'm looking back on it, but you never get away from London, because London and Peru were totally interlinked, because everything in Peru belonged to the Peruvian Corporation of London. London bankers in Leadenhall Street were pulling all the strings. They'd been given all this land. So you basically can't escape London. But maybe I'm going back into an older London.
Thank you. And maybe the last question, let's see, but it's by Hector Soto. He's wondering that today there are many migrants that writes about London, like Gureichi, Naipaul, Ishiguro. So do you think these two different their vision about the city from, let's say, years?
It's a different vision, of course, yeah. But I mean, you know, these are wonderful writers, some of them, and they have a vision of London which is sometimes more painfully or comically about their experiences against the kind of prejudices of whatever the London was at the time. So you might get someone like Samuel Selvon writing his Lonely Londoners book about the experiences of a Caribbean immigrant into London in a period of real prejudice, at the same time as the white South African-based writer Colin McInnes was writing City of Spades. He was kind of had a colonialist fascination for Black culture, but it was outsider looking in, whereas Selvon's book didn't get anything like the same attention at the time, but was a sort of more significant account of what that experience of London was. And it goes back to, as I mentioned, the Jewish writers who were writing the end of the 19th century and earlier 20th century of what it was like for them growing up, feeling they were part of a ghetto. And more voices are now covering a very rich new literature. And at the moment, it seems almost it's become almost dominant, because that question has been asked and people want that literature to get more attention. It's almost illegitimate for a sort of old white person like me to write at all. So probably in that sense too, it's a good thing to stop writing about London.
There is just another question, maybe this is the last one, that it relates to the previous one. Says that do you think there is any literary trace of Scottish poets in London?
Scottish poets in London, well, there've been some very good ones. I think, well, one of my favorite poets is the poet W.S. Graham, Sidney Graham, who I'm writing about at the moment myself, because he was part of an intriguing post-war generation in Soho. He was a friend of and rival of Dylan Thomas, and quite a serious drinker, and moved in that world of the painters Francis Bacon and Lucian Freud. He's photographed by photographer John Deakin, and was resolutely Clydeside as a poet, but ended up living down in Cornwall. And I think he's a major 20th century poet. Obviously, numerous other Scottish poets have settled in London for a time. I mean, a writer like Alexander Trokey, who came to London with a kind of background of New York and Glasgow, a beat writer, more of a novelist philosopher than a poet, but he wrote poetry too. So I mean, I think contemporary world, there are quite a lot of Scots poets. And going back, you know, you'd find ones the kind that the poet John Clare, who's a favourite of mine, was very much taken with. So there's a kind of Welsh, Scots, Irish poets come and go. I mean, London is a kind of challenging place where a lot of them feel they want to be for a time to make a reputation, but maybe retreat from too.
Fantastic. So thank you very much, Iain, for your talk and for this wonderful conversation. On behalf of the program, and I'm sure also on behalf of all the people that is being here today, I would like just to thank you so much for your time, and we really hope we keep in touch in the near future.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, it was a very interesting experience. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you.
Good night.
Take care. Good night.
Okay, thank you. Good night.